All right, we'll get started. We'll see if anyone else drifts in. All right, so next week we'll finish out our discussion of Kant with the final section, and that's on teleology or teleological beings. You'll see in the brackets that the appendix is optional, where he kind of gets into more of the implications of the whole argument. But the argument is complete if you just read to the end of the teleological judgment section. So we have some notes posted from for the readings for this week, and I guess I'd like then to take volunteers for next time. Anyone want to obligate themselves to post to the discussion thread for next week's reading? Two volunteers. Anybody? Remind me of your name. Okay, that's one. Second volunteer. Okay, remind me of your name.
Yeah, I can volunteer for next week, but I saw we're supposed to. I think all of us are supposed to submit to the discussion every week.
Recommended, but not required. So only the presenters are required, but everyone else is invited to and encouraged to, yes. So not everyone has to post to the discussion threads, but you should.
Yeah, I saw it.
Right. So you are volunteering for next week?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And remind me of your name? Okay, so you two then figure out how to divide up the discussion for next time in terms of posting notes. Good. All right, so, all right. So what I'd like to do is just start off by reminding us of the kind of general structure of Kant's argument in the Critique of Judgment and why it's divided up into the three sections that it is. So the beautiful, the sublime, and the teleological, or beautiful objects, sublime forces, and teleological beings. So what we're doing is we're kind of laying the framework last time and this time for what will be synthesized in the judgment of teleological beings, or even the concept of teleological beings for next time, because they combine the character of an object and a force. So what is a teleological being? We had some intimation of it last time. In the beautiful object, or the object that's judged as beautiful, seems to appear as purposiveness without purpose. Right, so that's already giving us a first determination of the teleological being, namely something that has itself as its own goal or aim or purpose. So a life form, that's what we're going to be talking about next time, like a life form or a form of life, which is the phrase that Nietzsche is going to use later in the semester. So a living being, what defines something as a living being is that it has itself as its own goal, telos, or purpose. And yet it exists for its own sake, so it doesn't have an external purpose, and that's why it can be purposiveness without purpose. So when an object, when it strikes us, when we judge it to be beautiful, when we have the experience of an object as beautiful, it seems to be alive. It seems to have that kind of character of spontaneous and self-determined or autonomous existence. And so probably you've heard the phrase artistic autonomy, and of course l'art pour l'art, art for art's sake. And people have looked askance at that in the previous century, in the 20th century, especially in the era of postmodernism. Art for art's sake came in for a bad rap in a variety of ways. Also because political art in the 20th century, there was a demand made that art justify itself politically. So art for art's sake was seen as like a bad bourgeois value by Marxists, Stalinists. But no, we're gonna stand by that idea because it originates with Kant. So why art for art's sake? Well, we'll see. It's life for its own sake. Life for its own sake. Organic life exists for its own sake. And human life for its own sake. So it's tied to a kind of humanism that humanity doesn't exist for another purpose, but exists for its own purpose. Is self-determining, is autonomous. So the autonomy of art is an example of, it's a subset of, our own autonomy. Right, so the self-legislated character of art, that art sets its own rules and fulfills them. Each artwork, in fact, does that. In the same way that each life form does that. Each living being does that. Each form of life does that, including humanity. So autonomy, self-determination, self-rule, self-legislation, giving itself as its own purpose. The beautiful object has the appearance of that. Of course, in itself, it isn't actually that, but it appears to us that way, and that's why we find pleasure in it. That's why we judge it to be beautiful. So that judgment of the beautiful is about seeing something in the object that reminds us of our own autonomy, our own freedom, our own existence for its own sake, our own self-justified existence. There's something about its aesthetic appearance, about its form, that gives it the sympathetic resonance with ourselves. So that sympathetic resonance of subject and object. So if the artwork seems to be like us in some way, in what way? If we like it, what do we like about it in that sense? Not like in the sense of it's gratifying or pleasant, but rather a disinterested appreciation, a disinterested affinity. So not an affinity for something because it serves a practical purpose for us, but rather an affinity for its own sake, that we see in the object something like ourselves.
So does disinterested mean that something doesn't, you don't have a purpose for something?
Right. So it doesn't fulfill our purpose. It seems to exist independently of us. That's what we appreciate about it. Right, so we can have an affinity for something, a sympathetic resonance with something that isn't existing or pleasing or gratifying or appreciated in terms of its fulfilling of our purposes. Right, so the purposelessness of art is important, or the beautiful, and because art is the imitation of nature, what is it imitating about nature? That nature seems to exist spontaneously, autonomously.
Would that like disinterested appreciation be kind of the same thing as just talking about like sturdy kinds of affection, or like the strenuous? I don't know how to say that word, but
You mean in the reading for this week?
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like when there's like a strain to like you appreciating something.
Oh, you mean that it takes an effort?
Yeah, I guess so.
Uh-huh. Well, that's where we're moving into the sublime forces. So it's a little bit different, right? So these things are not entirely separate, but analytically they're distinct for the purposes of clarifying what is it that we find pleasant or pleasing about it. Why do we respond positively, with positive feelings, to the object? We'll see it's a little bit different when we respond positively, when we have positive feelings about our experience of a sublime force. And that's a slightly different character to it. But with respect to the beautiful object, the reason that I'm tarrying on this a little bit is because, again, it should be as clear as possible to you guys what's meant by the beautiful. And what's meant by aesthetic form as a character of things that we judge to be beautiful. Meaning, what does form mean in that respect? it means that it gives itself its form. Right? So it's not, we might think of form as something that's imposed externally on phenomena, but it's quite the opposite. So we might immediately connotate the concept of form with a kind of trying to fit the square peg into the round hole kind of a problem, right? Kind of form content. Form is imposed on content. No, the idea is that form, a self-giving form, that the beautiful object seems to have given itself its own form, not a form imposed from without. Because that's part of this, the disinterested character. So the disinterested character is that when something is defined by our purposes, when an object is a theoretical or conceptual object, or when it's a practical object, then what we are doing is we are, the way he puts it, judging according to a concept. Right, so the beautiful is something that we judge without a concept. So when we're kind of classifying things or grasping things, again, concept is begriff, we're grasping things mentally, when we have a mental apprehension of things, through our concepts of them, then they are fitting our concept of them. So in that respect, there's a kind of a match between what the object is and our concept of it. So that would be more like an externally applied form in the form of the concept. Similarly, so then judging according to a concept means, okay, this fits my concept and I have a good feeling about that because my concept is satisfied. My theoretical faculty, my understanding is fulfilled. And that's why we feel good about it. So if something matches our concept, we like it. As opposed to something that doesn't match our concept, which might be kind of dissonant, it might be kind of irritating, it might give us an unpleasant feeling. It might be painful for us to not have something match our concept of it because it defies our mental apprehension of it, our mental grasp of it. Right, so feelings of pleasure and pain are involved in all of our faculties, in the understanding, in practical reason, and in aesthetic judgment. So the feeling of pleasure and pain when dealing with conceptual objects, objects that we're grasping through concepts or through theories, then it's kind of a matching of our theory or our concept, and then the pleasure is fulfilling our understanding or concept. The pain would be, doesn't make sense to us. So judging without a concept means that the object makes sense to us, but in a non-conceptual or theoretical way. So it does make sense, but not because it matches our concept of the beautiful. So there's a little paradox here. This is the dialectic. Because the concept of the beautiful will be based on our past experience of the beautiful. So everything that we have found beautiful, or things that we've been aesthetically educated culturally to regard as beautiful, even in terms of like judging them to be beautiful, not just, fitting a concept. The concept of the beautiful is a little bit of a contradiction in terms. It's a paradox, and that's intentional on Kant's part. So something really strikes us as beautiful when it goes beyond our concept of the beautiful, when it's new and different from our concept of the beautiful. So the issue for Kant is, he's a philosopher, so he's analyzing our cognitive process, saying, how could something that is new and different, that we don't have a concept for, ever feel good to us? Wouldn't it, by its very nature, not make sense, cause pain? Wouldn't we reject it rather than accept it? Well, he says that might be true in the case of the understanding, in terms of judging according to a concept or judging according to a theory. We might reject things that don't make sense to us conceptually or theoretically. And yet there are phenomena that we do accept without that being a matter of our understanding, our concepts, our theories. So the beautiful object is an example of that. That's something that we take pleasure in, even though it doesn't make sense according to a concept, and even though it is different from our prior aesthetic experience. So it's something new and different, something unexpected, something that doesn't fit an established pattern of experience. So the real question is, how can we possibly have, what are the conditions of possibility for having a new experience or an experience of the new? And how can we ever feel good about it? Why don't we reject the unfamiliar? Why don't we just reject the unknown? How is it possible for us to mentally, experientially, at the level of feeling, accept, embrace the unknown? Because that's freedom. That's freedom. Right? If we only accept what we're familiar with already, then that's not freedom. That would be basically a variation on instinctual behavior. We're sort of hardwired to respond to certain things, and so we respond to those things. Okay, that makes sense. But the question is, why do we ever respond positively to things that we don't have a prior concept or a prior experience for? How could the new and the different ever cause us pleasure rather than pain? Because it makes sense that something unfamiliar would be painful. And yet not always. Sometimes it's pleasurable. The experience of the beautiful is meant to capture that possibility. Right, so what are we doing when we respond positively to something that we don't have a prior concept for? We're feeling something about it. Why would we feel that way about it? You know, what kind of feeling is that? What kind of aesthetic response is that? And this is why the aesthetical judgment is the freest of the faculties. It's freer than understanding or practical reason. So I didn't mention practical reason. One of the reasons is that we'll be talking about that with respect to the Sublime today. But practical reason, let's include that for a second. So if something is practically gratifying to us, if it may not, just satisfy a concept or a theory, it may not just satisfy our understanding, but it might fulfill a practical purpose. It might be something that we can engage at the level of our practical reason. The beautiful object and the understanding, the reason that those are connected for Kant, is that they're the most abstract apprehension of things. Right, so practical reason is much more concrete, and therefore has a different kind of quality, a different character in our cognition.
It is abstract, but there is a certain inquiry or certain principle that it's not learned, that it's not socially adapted. And I think that's the hardest part to really understand, because it is that, and then he's trying to pinpoint that. I think I got a bit lost from section 28 to 30, when he's really trying to...
About the genius.
Not the genius, that's later on. I think it's the inquiry of an object and a judgment of taste.
Oh,
the
okay,
deduction
so,
part.
Uh-huh. Oh, you mean the beginning of,
Yeah.
like when he's reviewing.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, just a few paragraphs down. Mm-hmm. All right, so let's talk about the a priori. So we talked about this a little bit. So the a priori, because these phrases, especially because they're like Latin, and so like anytime you engage like a Greek or Latin phrase, you just want to run and hide. So don't. Right? It's like the a priori, and especially when it's turned into a metaphysical thing, like the a priori. It's Latin. But anyway, you were going to say more.
Yeah. I guess. How does it differ from principle, precepts, and like those three? I guess are important in like understanding.
Mm-hmm.
They can sort of functions the same.
Right. So again, these things are not entirely like there's not a clean line separating these things.
Yeah.
So these distinctions that he's making are just analytic distinctions, and it's just to help clarify. So if we think about the exercise of aesthetical judgment and the judgments of the beautiful as going beyond our conceptual understanding of things or conceptual grasp of things, it helps. Because again, when we do feel good about our understanding, when an object satisfies our understanding, when we feel like we understand something, we do have a positive feeling. There's an aesthetic moment in that. So in terms of the a priori, what goes into the experience, what is before, what's prior to the experience, that conditions the experience. So here's the rub. So not determined by, but conditioned by. Not determined by, but conditioned by. Again, conditions of possibility. What makes these kinds of cognitions or feelings, because feelings are cognitive, possible. So the conditions of possibility for aesthetical judgments are different from the conditions of possibility for conceptual kind of applications, right? So grasping something through a concept. So, the first critique is much longer than the second and the third critique because we have all sorts of concepts. And so sorting through, distinguishing all the different kinds of concepts we have takes a lot more kind of analytic breakdown to do. So this is a lot shorter because it's actually less determinate. And because we do have less language for this. We do have less terminology, we have less discursive tools for talking about the beautiful, right? It's kind of a catch-all category. Now we can talk about some things, and he's going to get into it today. He gets into the genres, the media, the concrete forms of art, and does a kind of a hierarchy of what he calls aesthetical worth, aesthetical value. Which again, we're going to have to bear with him and understand why, how that might be the case, rather than just being like, oh yeah, this is just his own personal taste or opinion. There's more to it than that. Okay, but backing up a second. So, all right, so the a priori in this case, and then it's not irrational. That's not irrational. That's very key, because we might want to throw everything with feeling into a kind of irrational or psychological. Right? He does think we can rationally cognize it. In other words, we can reflect on it, we can grasp it, and it's not something that depends on our psychology or our mood. Right? So it's an a priori that is different from an individual psychology or temperament, or a mood in a moment, right? So not only in terms of the individual person, their character, their psychology, but also the mood that they happen to be in. Now, what is that? It just means we can reflect on it independently of those things. In other words, this can be recognized by everyone. So he thinks this is a universal faculty. Everyone can recognize it, regardless of psychology, regardless of mood. So that means it has to be more general, more indeterminate. And so that's why, this category of the a priori is throughout all of his work. It's just the point of what goes into an experience that's prior to it, but also what continues through the experience and what comes out the other end of the experience. What is affected by the experience? What's changed by the experience? Right, that's our subjectivity. So I do want to say something about this, because we're going to get into it with the genius bit today. So, genius can't be taught. The beautiful is judged not according to a concept, so you can't be told what is beautiful. That's not how it works. But you can learn to appreciate things aesthetically. You can have an aesthetical education. You can. But that's quite different from being taught, this is beautiful, that's not beautiful. So your taste can be developed. You can be aesthetically educated. But again, what makes that possible? Because we'll see that genius is a mixture of talent and education. Now, what I'll say about this also is that, Kant assumes that everyone has an aesthetical education. So an aesthetical education does not mean going to art school. That's not what it means. It might be the opposite. No, indeed. All right, so that's a very important point, actually, that Omer just raised. So going to art school might cloud your aesthetical judgment with a lot of concepts, right? It might give you a kind of a false set of concepts that you might mistake for what you actually feel about things. This is the question of modern and modernist art, since this is the philosophy of modernism, and we had that in the Hamza Walker. Does anyone like modernist art? Maybe not, right? Is it pleasant? Perhaps not, right? Maybe not. It might be a little austere. It might be a little painful even, right? So something that begins with romanticism, but it's also there prior to that, but it's thematized in romanticism, was an art not only about the beautiful, but also about the sublime. Right? Isn't it also about causing us pain? It is. But modernist art is especially kind of masochistic, isn't it? Like to go and, it's like, how they put the modern wing over in its own sort of sequestered space, right? To not trouble the suburbanites who are there to just see the pretty pictures. And so it's like, yeah, we're not going to make them see the Warhol if they don't have to, right? Because they know that people who are there to see pretty pictures aren't necessarily going to appreciate the pain that is caused by the more modern stuff, right? The 20th century stuff, right? So, and yet, obviously, that art is supposed to be about how we feel about it. And yet, an art education, a formal art education might just give you classifications. It might give you kind of a pattern recognition software, right? So this is why I don't think artificial intelligence will ever exist. Children, I'll just get this out there. AI will never happen, and extraterrestrials also aren't going to happen. So neither of the dystopian, utopian things are ever going to happen. They're just fantasies that the aliens are going to come down and save us, or they're going to come down and destroy us, or AI is going to save us, or AI is going to destroy us. This is a fantasy. So it's not going to happen. Right, so why did I bring that up? Because the best that we can do is make machines do a pattern recognition. That's the best thing we can do. We do machine learning, we can't do artificial intelligence. So machine learning, pattern recognition. We're more than that. Right. One of the reasons why I can't stand the idea of artificial intelligence is that it acts as if we are just pattern recognition machines. Right. So we can make robots do what we do. No, we can't, because we actually do something that robots can't do and can never do. We'll never be able to do. So we are robots, by the way, but we're more than robots. Right. So 99.99% of the time we are robots. We're animals. Animals are robots. But we're more than robots. Actually, animals are more than the robots that we make, but we might be able to make robots that approximate animals. But we won't actually achieve something that does what humans can do. And that's Kant's entire point. Okay, so this is not my opinion, this is Kant. Remember, I'm Kant's defense attorney. So if we beam Kant into 2024, and he talks to Elon Musk, and Elon Musk talks to him about artificial intelligence, Kant would be like, my child, I'm sorry, no. I know. You have problems processing these things, clearly. Clearly he has problems processing these things. But no. They might. So, but again, something that's not pattern recognition. Education that's not pattern recognition. Imagine that. Imagine being educated in a way that isn't just about stuffing your head with patterns that you can apply to phenomena, classification schemes. Imagine an education that's not about that, but that's about building your capacity to exercise your cognitive faculties. Do we even try that anymore? I don't know. We are trying that here, right? So, you know, a basic point is there are practical cognitions. There are things that people do in practice that they can't explain conceptually or theoretically. Practice goes beyond theory. It does. It really does. A practical education can go beyond anything that you can learn through concepts. Similarly, an aesthetic education can go beyond a practical education. And yet an aesthetic education is involved in all those things. A conceptual education still is an aesthetic education. It's just that there's more to it than that. Again, why are we attracted to some concepts, some ways of thinking about things, understanding things than others? Because they feel better to us. Right, so an aesthetic judgment is always involved. It's always involved. And yet can never be explained, can never be fully accounted for conceptually. Right? But it begins with the fact that practical reason goes beyond our understanding. We can do things that we can't explain. We can do things that we don't have concepts for. Again, art is that.
Well, what's the difference between aesthetic judgments and practical aesthetic judgments?
Right, so practical aesthetic judgment means that the feeling of pleasure that we get is in the satisfaction of a practical purpose. Whereas the disinterested judgment of taste, of beauty, but we'll see now with the sublime, is something that, again, is not explicable, not accountable, as fulfilling a practical purpose for us. So art curators are in a bind, aren't they? Because they have to professionally exercise judgment, except there are all sorts of other, right? They have to think about the judgment of their clients. They have to think about their audience. They have to think about putting on shows that people will like. Yeah. No. Right? So, you know, because who's going to dare to put on a show that people may not like? Who's going to risk that? They'll risk getting fired. Right? Because you need to sell tickets, you need to sell art. Right? No, it works against everything that he's talking about. Right? So again, he knows that art is a commodity. He knows he's living in the time. He knows that, you know, you're flattering people's established taste. And most of the time that's what's going on. But there's sometimes, however rare, that it's not accountable that way. It's not explainable that way. That's what he's interested in, because that tiny modicum is the freedom, right? Where we're not just doing a culturally authorized activity, where we're doing more than that. It might be rare, it might hardly ever happen, but it does happen, and so the question is, what makes that possible? All right, so that brings us into, you know, again, if we think of these things as ways of freedom appearing. So the beautiful object is an appearance of freedom. Our judgment of something as beautiful is an appearance of the freedom of our faculties, the freedom of our being, the self-determination, the autonomy, the self-legislation that we have, our freedom. Now let's see how the sublime also is an appearance of that. So there are three phenomena that we're dealing last week, this week, and next week. And that means 3 forms of appearance, 3 appearances. Appearances of what? Freedom. Keep that in the back of your mind. So appearances that we make aesthetical judgments about. All right, so the very first line of this section that we wrote for today. The beautiful and the sublime agree in this, that both please in themselves. Both please in themselves. Meaning they don't have an external reason for their pleasing character. Both please in themselves. Further, neither presupposes a judgment of sense, nor a judgment logically determined. Okay, so what is that? We're going to have this in 2 weeks when we do Schiller. So Schiller's Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man is going to revisit Kant and use slightly different terms. It's going to be form drive, sense drive, and play drive. So judgments of sense are practical judgments. Judgments logically determined are judgments of the understanding. Right, so judgments of sense are judgments of reason, practical reason. Logical judgments, judgments of understanding. So neither a judgment of sense nor a judgment logically determined, but a judgment of reflection. Okay, so this is something that he's already addressed in the reading from last week. Judging without a concept, a reflective judgment. So judging without a concept is a reflective judgment. This is just the way he's using these terms. So logical judgments, sensible judgments, and now reflective judgments. So consequently, the satisfaction does not depend on a sensation, as in the case of the pleasant, nor on a definite concept, as in the case of the good, but it is nevertheless referred to concepts, although indeterminate ones. So notice he flipped things a little bit there. So sensation, judgment of sense, pleasant. Okay, so that he's tying their pleasant sensations to practical satisfactions. So things that satisfy our senses in a positive way. Why do we have those kinds of sensations? Well, they are our sense perception faculties that we have as organisms to help us survive. Right, so we do have things encoded in us physically that help guide us in a practical way through the world of sensation. Nor a definite concept, as in the case of the good. Okay, so again, the good you would normally associate with practical reason. With what is the good that we want? Why do we want it? The faculty of desire in practical reason. What's the good that we want? How do we achieve it in practice? Why do we desire what we want? How do we achieve it in practice? Now, why is that? Again, like practical reason, because humans don't just satisfy our practical needs in one static way forever, meaning we have changed how we satisfy our practical needs historically, culturally. Right? That's also an element of our freedom. We don't act according to a fixed nature, according to direct biological need and instinct, but we've modified our biological needs and instincts, and we satisfy them in new ways, practically, through cultural, social history. We're creating new needs for ourselves, so we're constantly changing what the good is. Why does he associate that with a definite concept? Well, definite concept in the sense of like a practical aim. So the good is still determinate, as a determinate character, but we're talking about a reflective judgment, which is indeterminate. What does that mean? It means you go out into the world and you are struck by things that are beautiful. All of his examples, all of his illustrations of this, are that we're surprised by beautiful. We're not expecting it, we're not looking for it. It's not the goal of our practical activity. Yet we find it. And so the satisfaction is connected with the mere presentation of the object, or with the faculty of presentation. So that in the case of a given intuition, this faculty, or the imagination, is considered as an agreement with the faculty of concepts of understanding or reason in its furtherance of these latter. All right, so let's unpack that. All right, so the appearance of something. Keep this in mind because Nietzsche later, he's going to talk about the appearance of appearance. The appearance of appearance. He's got a bone to pick with Kant, but actually he is Kantian nonetheless. Right? And he doesn't like disinterested. He's like, no, I am interested. I'm very interested. The beautiful, I care. And that's not what Kant's talking about. It's not what Kant's talking about. But anyway. So the mere presentation of the object, the faculty of presentation, meaning how is it that things can appear to us at all? The appearance of appearance. Aesthetic appearance as such. Presentation meaning something presenting itself, something being made present, not in the sense of time, but in the sense of space. And of course that's a function of our imagination, meaning the world of appearance, the way things appear to us, has to do with this a priori faculty of the imagination. Meaning we're not just moving through the world, robots with sensors, sense data perception, right? The robotic dog that can, rescue babies from burning buildings, no, right? No, the world is as it is because of how we're imagining it. So we're actively imagining the world as we're taking in our sense data perceptions of it. So we're actively constructing the world in our imagination. We're not just registering sense data perception, like computers with sensors. We are doing that, but we're doing more than that. The imagination. And again, presentation, the appearance, but like as an active thing. The imagination. We're always doing it. We're always imagining the world. We're always exercising our imagination. Okay, so then both kinds of judgments are singular and yet announce themselves as universally valid for every subject, although they lay claim merely to the feeling of pleasure and not to any knowledge of the object. Okay, so the universal validity, what is the universal validity? It's not going to be accountable by any conceptual knowledge. But it seems to be a necessary condition and possibility for every subject. Meaning, to be a subject, you have to be able to do this. You have to be able to imagine the world. Right, so it seems like a kind of a baseline. Again, it's universal because we all seem to be able to do it.
Can you explain the not to any knowledge of the object?
Well, again, that would be conceptual knowledge. So again, because you might lack a concept, like, so let's say that someone, doesn't have a concept, nonetheless,
They can still understand or try to reason.
aesthetically, like they can still have this aesthetic experience. So even though the aesthetic judgment is the highest faculty, it's also the first faculty. Meaning we have this faculty before we have knowledge. Right? So we have the faculty of pleasure and pain, but we also have the faculty of imagination prior to any knowledge. So again, you don't need knowledge of the beautiful in order to be able to experience the beautiful. What's interesting is that, so aesthetic judgment would be the kind of first faculty, and then after that would be practical reason, and then finally would come the understanding. So even though he did his 3 critiques in the order of understanding, reason, judgment, actually, not only individually would this be true, but culturally, the history of the human race. We started with imagination, he thinks, and that guided our practical reason. In other words, how we imagined the world affected how we engaged it practically. And then finally, we had concepts. So concepts come last. What comes first is feeling. What comes second is practice. And what comes third is theory. Right, in the history of the species, culturally, historically, socially, also we can think about it individually. It's one of the more notorious aspects of the Enlightenment, is that they analogize historical development to individual development. Right? So they think about like the past as like the childhood of the species, which then makes people think, oh, cultural imperialism, white settler colonialist discourse, la 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 la. Sorry. There are some things that are you can only respond through ululation. You can only respond with your first faculty, aesthetics. You can only respond with a feeling of pain to some discourse, children. All right. Remarkable differences between the beautiful and the sublime. The beautiful in nature is connected with the form of the object, which consists in having boundaries. The sublime, on the other hand, is to be found in a formless object, so far as in it, or by occasion of it, as in it, or by occasion of it, boundlessness is represented. And yet its totality is also present to thought. So we are able to hold it in our minds, even though it's boundless. So an object is by its very nature bounded, and in that way has a form. So that's what characterizes the beautiful.
How is it related? Well, just reminds a lot of like the structuralist values when it comes to beautiful, not like perfect,
Having boundedness. It's related. I mean, Kant's not inventing this out of nowhere. He is trying to, so the ambition of Kant's philosophy, so I think I might have mentioned this to you guys, or maybe I didn't, so I'll use this as the occasion, which is that Kant thought that he started philosophy. Yes. And he did. He started critical philosophy. He started the philosophy of freedom. And then we'll see Hegel completed it. It's called the 25 Years of Philosophy. Started by Kant, completed by Hegel. And then after that, we're just free and we don't need philosophers to tell us anything anymore. Because everyone's a philosopher, and so we don't need a formal philosophy to explain it back to us. Right? It was very optimistic about the progress of the human species. As it turns out, no. We now need to be told by Kant again what we should already know, and what he thought of people already knew in his time. Wait, how did we get on that? Plato, yes. Yet at the same time, he thinks, well, the ancient philosophers, the pre-critical philosophers, the not modern philosophers, they were talking about something, right? So what he thinks, and this is what all philosophers do, which is that they try to explain past philosophy, but better than the past philosophers did.
Sorry, I don't think I fully understand when you say that critical philosophy is old plain philosophy.
Yes. All right, so concepts of nature, the concept of freedom. Remember that from last week? All right, so he thinks all past philosophy has been concerned with concepts of nature. And what makes his philosophy real philosophy is because it's critical philosophy, because its subject is no longer concepts of nature, but the concept of freedom. Meaning, Kant's entire philosophy is about freedom. That's going to be true through Hegel, too. And so, I think Robert Pippin told us in the first day of class, he said, the issue of change and new form of life and the discontent with this form of life and how we're going to fulfill it and overcome it. Freedom. I'm not sure if he said freedom. Did Pippin say freedom? Yeah, these 60s generation people, they have an allergy. They're really, they escaped from the killing fields of Kampuchea. They can't bear to talk about freedom anymore. Right? But no. We have to talk about freedom, especially when we're reading Kant.
Is that what so when people say critical theory, it means theory about
Yes, that's exactly what it means. That's absolutely right. Yes, that's exactly in a nutshell what it's about. Yeah, critical theory. It's the theory of freedom. That's what makes it critical. Otherwise, it would just be a positive theory. It would just be a kind of ordinary theory. It would be concepts of nature. So we talked about this last time. Let's just remind ourselves of that. What is? What is? This is running out of juice. Concept of nature, or about what is? Destroy it. And the concept of freedom. What ought to be. So the potential and possibility for change. Or transformation. Right, so philosophy up to this point has been about what is. Now philosophy has to be about what ought to be. It's revolutionary philosophy. Plato was not interested in revolution. Neither were any of the philosophers really before Kant. Right, so why is he interested in revolution? Because it's happening. It's happening in practice, it's happening in reality, and then means that the old philosophy can't explain it. Can't explain it. I mentioned Schiller. When we get to Schiller, Schiller's going to be talking about the French Revolution, directly. He's going to be like, how could I possibly be writing about aesthetics when politics is happening? And he's writing during the Jacobin Terror. So the most extreme revolutionary moment, right, that's gripping the world. The world, it is. Everyone around the world is aware of what's going on. Most civilizations anyway. Some, I guess, maybe got the news late, but pretty much they had global communication already back then. So certainly the Muslim world knows what's going on. China knew what was going on. India knew what was going on. Everybody knew what was going on. So, and it was like, yeah, freedom. Is that freedom? What is that? The reason I bring that up just now is that he will, in discussing the sublime, he'll talk about the law as sublime. He'll also talk about society as sublime. So later, after he wrote this book, this is 1790, the Jacobin Terror didn't happen. When he heard about the Jacobin Terror, he said, it's sublime. It's sublime. So the Jacobin Terror, it's sublime. Why? Because it's actually not terrifying. It's fearful, but not terrifying. It's fearful, but we're not overwhelmed by it. I don't know, maybe we are overwhelmed by it. But no, we're not overwhelmed by it because we can appreciate the freedom in it. He wasn't alone in that, by the way. Thomas Jefferson, in the United States, the ambassador to France, the American ambassador to France, wrote back, and they're like, the Jacobins are going crazy, what the fuck? And Jefferson's like, no, this is good, right? Because it's freedom. And he said, yes, innocent people are dying, that's sad, but they would have given their lives anyway in the cause of freedom. And if the whole world is depopulated except one man and one woman, but left as free, it will be worth it. That's the spirit we're talking about here. That's Kant, that's Hegel, that's Schiller. That's the spirit.
Didn't you also say that war is sublime in many ways, if both sides reside by caring for the citizens, if they both follow the rules, then war is sublime? War is sublime too. Easy for him to say. Well, because war is a human social historical activity, it's not just chaos. It's not just some kind of bestiality, right? It's war is a human activity, and people conduct it rationally, supposedly, according to Kant. Most people have thought so. I'm sure if you go to the Pentagon, they will tell you that war is conducted rationally, more or less. It might be easy for them to say, but there's a philosophy of war, right? There's a philosophy of war, and they are reading the philosophy of war not only in terms of the European experience, but also others, right? So they know the art of war. They do. The Europeans, and they're like, okay, human civilizations have conducted war, so there must be something rational in it, right? And yet, it is about, so it's according to the rules, but it's breaking the rules. You see how it could be sublime? Because it's sort of like, it does proceed according to lawfulness, but it also defies that, and also changes it. Because that's the other thing, is that he's kind of a Hegelian before Hegel. He thinks that the history of the human species, through all of its violence, has nonetheless been a kind of progress. We've developed in and through these horrible experiences as a species. How? Well, because we've been able to not be overwhelmed, but still rationally cognize them. So again, fearful but not terrifying, not overwhelming our senses. That's the sublime. The sublime is something that threatens to overwhelm us, but doesn't. So it's a threshold phenomenon. Mm-hmm.
But so does that mean that the sublime cannot transcend?
How so?
Because if you see, you say that it's, so basically it's the idea of something that we have inside our imagination that makes us not be overwhelmed by the thing itself. And so in that sense, if we cannot be overwhelmed, we cannot be transcended.
No, we can transcend. In other words, if we were overwhelmed, then that would defeat our transcendental faculty. That would because we would just sort of break down. We wouldn't be able to
So let's talk about this, the sublime, the feeling of the sublime. So if the feeling of the beautiful is that in the object we see a reflection of our own autonomy, our own freedom, in the sublime, why do we have a feeling of pleasure in something that would otherwise be painful? Right, so he has a notion that the painful, so before the painful would just be something that's sort of discordant, something that doesn't match, something that doesn't make sense. Now the painful is something that would overwhelm. So the idea is that any overwhelming sensation is, by virtue of being overwhelming, painful. So the sublime is something that it's sort of painful until it's pleasurable. It sort of threatens to overwhelm us, sort of at our first sort of experience of it is a sort of a pain, but then we have the pleasure in not being overwhelmed, and therefore the pain not overwhelming us.
Not being overwhelmed, but to be to recognize or to
So we can recognize this. We can reflect on it. Again, this is another reflective judgment.
Is there a cognitive faculty there, so in practice?
Right. So, he's got grand examples of it, but then he's got more quotidian examples of it. So quotidian examples would simply be in any practical action. Things may not go exactly according to plan. So when you act practically, you aren't just fulfilling a concept. And because you're stepping out beyond what something planned could do, you're risking kind of not keeping control over that action. And then that's painful, except you don't lose control, you maintain control in the practical action, and that's the pleasure. The pleasure is that you're sort of on the edge there, right? Things aren't going according to plan, but you're not losing control. You're catching the wave, right? You're the surfer, you're catching the wave, right? You just have to feel your way through it. And yet, because it's a threshold phenomenon, because you're catching the wave, you have to ride the edge of the wave. You're always on the edge of missing the wave, losing control, being swamped, right? And the pleasure is in that not happening, right? But you couldn't feel that pleasure unless you felt the pain of it about to happen. Right, so you're sort of skirting the edge of fulfilling a concept, going according to plan. But it's not something that can just go according to plan. This is where practical reason goes beyond conceptual understanding or theory. And yet it isn't escaping our capability to grasp it.
So like you mean that the sublime is not an end but just a way?
Mm-hmm. Right. That's why it's associated with practical reason, and that's why it's a force. It's an appearance of a force rather than of an object. So what we're dealing with here is, so the imagination, when we imagine something, we have an image of it in our mind. So a beautiful object is beautiful in our imagination. Our image of it is beautiful rather than the thing in itself. So here, it's a little bit different because it's not like there's an image, right? There isn't. There's just a feeling. And it is a dynamic feeling. And that's why we'll see that he's got, two different kind of examples of the sublime, the mathematical sublime and the dynamic sublime. Right? But it's basically the apprehension not of an object, so it's not something that we have an image of, but it's something that we nonetheless are able to mentally apprehend, but more as a force. So, right, when we try to calculate things that are imponderably large, right, how we're apprehending it in our mind is to try to break it down into mathematical units, right? So we say 1,000,000. Basically, 1,000,000 is an unimaginable number. Like you could never like see 1,000,000 things in front of you. No. So what is 1,000,000? It's 1,000 things. Well, 1,000 is kind of hard too. So what's 1,000? It's like 1,000 things. 100 you can kind of, yeah, but what is 100? 100 is like 10 times 10, right? So when we're doing that, we're trying to apprehend something that really defies our mental apprehension, but by analytically breaking it down into manageable parts and then grasping it that way. Mm-hmm.
Can you like have apprehend a force of the sublime? It's like it's totally imaginary. Like for example, if I imagine space, or like if I imagine a giant whale underneath the water, there's a boat. The whale's so much bigger that I'm like, oh my god, that's really stressful. But it's also like it's like intriguing. Space and whales.
Yep.
Like, but I've never seen space or a whale. But like even.
You haven't seen a whale? At the aquarium. We got the whales.
No, not like a big one though.
A big one. You got to go whale watching. You do. In wherever, Vancouver, San Francisco. I don't know if they do them on the East Coast. They did it in Iceland. When I went on my honeymoon, Iceland, we could go whale watching.
You saw ones that
Yeah,
were like
absolutely.
huge.
Yeah, huge. Bigger than the boat.
So if it's only in that, like with space, I guess then like it's real violent in there.
I mean outer space.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think William Shatner went up in the Jeff Bezos one. So there's the Boeing one, there's the SpaceX one, and there's a Jeff Bezos one, which looks like a phallus. What is it called? The Blue Earth? No, Blue Origin. No, that's up the Virgin Atlantic people. What's the Blue Origin? Is Blue Origin Bezos? It might be. But William Shatner, Star Trek, Captain Kirk. He, so his whole fictional character is about space travel. But then, they just went into orbit and came right back down. And he's like, oh, it's nothing that you could imagine. Like, it defies all prior concepts of it. So he had a sublime experience in that sense. Because again, it was sort of an almost overwhelming experience, but not overwhelming. Mm-hmm. Right, just as an example of what you're talking
But
about.
like if you just imagine something like a concept,
It's still an experience.
and that's still like would be a force.
Well, you're trying to mentally, okay, so here's the force pit. So when something is an overwhelming phenomenon, how does it strike us? How does it appear to us? It appears to us as something that is potentially overwhelming to us. So because it's potentially overwhelming, even if it's like something like space or volume, like the size of a whale or the size of the Earth, this is example, right? When we try to imagine the size of the Earth, it's like an imponderably large thing. The force that we feel in the face of that, this is an example of the mathematical sublime, is actually the force of our own imagination struggling to mentally hold it. So the force is actually not external, it's internal. So when we experience something as having a force, in terms of our cognition of it, what we're really experiencing, according to Kant, is the force of our imagination trying to grasp it.
That's why the boundlessness of the experience is our own. We recognize our own power.
Boundlessness, that's right. So when we are able to grasp something that is overwhelming to us, but not be overwhelmed by it, we're actually feeling our own boundlessness, our own infinity, right? The kind of indeterminateness of our own faculties.
Is that a little bit
Erotic?
No.
Neurotic.
Neurotic and neurotic.
No, neurotic's better. Let's stick with that one.
This like very humanist, intrinsic, the, I need to say like we're awesome.
That's not neurotic. That would be the opposite of neurotic.
No, I thought that's.
No? I don't know why.
Well, then maybe not.
Neurotic would be that we regress
Yeah.
and therefore have an infantile response to things, and so we kind of crawl back into ourselves. So whereas Kant is describing, here's the Sublime, children, you certainly have seen this one. Right, this is like, sorry children, I know, but it's good anyway. So here's the Sublime, right? Because this painting is not really about what he's seeing, because you don't see much. He's got the bare suggestion of what he might be seeing. What the painting is depicting is a mental state. Right? It's not really depicting a vista, an awesome view of things. It's depicting this dude who's like standing like on this, cliff. Like nobody would stand at the edge of a cliff like that. That would just no. You'd be like hanging on for dear life, right? You might if you're a psycho. No, go ahead.
But so basically, when you reach the sublime, you kind of reduce the concepts.
Right. It's in other words, it's something that we're not grasping as a concept. We're not grasping it as an object either. Right. So there's something potentially, very much objectless about this. So the wanderer above a sea of fog. The point is that there is nothing. Right. So all he's seeing is like vast space and vast depth. This chasm that he could fall into.
And it's not a constant.
It's not a constant.
Yeah.
Is that what you said? Right. So
Once we register it, I feel like it's very temporal almost.
That's why it would be a force. Yeah, that's why it would be a force. It would be, again, thinking about things in that dimension.
And then regarding to temporal context, when you say defy all prior experience, does it require a comparison to the past?
Well, again, if we're just doing that, then what we're doing is
Practical.
conceptual, right? Basically, we have a memory of something. You could have a practical memory of something, but you could also have an image of something. And that's when it would be more accountable as a beautiful. What I always like to say about this painting is painting beautiful? Not particularly. Not particularly. Not much to look at visually. It's very static in some ways. It's very symmetrical. It does have this kind of vortex quality. It's got some, the kind of composition sort of suggests movement, but not. Also because that would, because the guy is not experiencing vertigo. That's the point. The point is that this gives you a sense of you might be on the verge of vertigo, but you're not. Right? But so this is a much, as a romantic painting, it's actually very conceptual. It's sort of giving you a kind of bare bones or schematic image that suggests more a concept. The concept of the sublime. Right? It's not giving you the aesthetic experience of the sublime, it's only giving you a sort of hint of it. But it itself is not, this is not like a sublime experience. This is a picture of someone having a sublime experience in which we have to imagine ourselves in the place of the person. Right? But the painting itself is not sublime.
I was just in Turner's paintings, how the ocean is depicted like so forcefully, but in an abstract way, and that abstraction is sort of like a means of communicating the boundlessness of the powers.
Right, it suggests it, right.
Yeah.
Definitely, it suggests it. But again, without actually giving the sensation of it, giving you the representation of it.
Do you think that if a painter is so skilled in a way that makes you recognize their, virtuosity and your lack of it, that could give you a similar experience with Sublime because it's out of your realm of what you can understand?
Yes, so I would say that's right. So I wasn't saying this is a bad painting. I wasn't. But what I was saying is that it has a different aim than like the representation of beauty. Which again, the art of the beautiful painting is in trying to have the painting imitate the beauty of nature. Meaning it's not the same as the beauty of nature, but it sort of imitates it. It sort of represents that kind of experience, but in a way that, of course, is different from the visual experience of a physical thing.
So if the painting's beauty comes from the way it repurposes the way that nature is beautiful, but then if you were to change the aesthetics of the painting in ways of trying to communicate that, then you're not entirely divorcing aesthetics from concept. It seems like that seems to me more like practical aesthetics rather than just pure aesthetics. Because then if it was pure aesthetics, it wouldn't be in relation to nature. It would just be the of itself, right?
Well, what you're doing is you're objectifying the imagination. So the painting doesn't objectify the visual sense. Doesn't objectify or represent a sense perception. It represents an imagination. So here, what's being represented is the imagination of the sublime, rather than the imagination of the beautiful. Right. So that's where the formal structure of a painting would imitate, in some way, the formal structure of the aesthetic experience of the beautiful, without being the same as. And so it is like a practical demonstration, of course it is. Meaning we always look at art as a man-made thing, as a human-made thing, and as a practical exercise in our ability to represent things. Right, so in that respect, what you're doing is a kind of practical demonstration rather than a logical argument, in which you are demonstrating the aesthetic experience. And again, it's always based on a kind of cultural practice, meaning painting is always the history of painting, so people come in with certain expectations about what a picture is culturally, but then the artist works with that in order to imitate, reproduce, and represent something of the experience that we would have of physical things or natural things.
So can one painting be sublime or exact beautiful, but art, like painting as concept is sublime?
Yes, so basically what I'm trying to represent here for you is why Kant would think that art is less than nature, aesthetically. Because he would say that it is a practical demonstration of the operation of the imagination, and as such, it isn't actually the imagination. It's more like the viewer is having their imagination in play with the artist's imagination as formally presented in the painting. So it's kind of mediated, right? So it's not the direct imaginary construction of the world, but rather a kind of dialogue between the viewer's imagination and the artist's imagination, in which the artist's imagination is demonstrating itself through the practical medium of the art form, the painting.
With neutralist painters like Donald Judd or Robert Ryman, they're trying to take the imagination out of it.
Yes.
But then it's still there.
Sure, but where is it? It's in the viewer. right? This is kind of radicalization, and that's something just to think about, is why would we move in a dehumanized direction in art? Right, so in other words, of course, we should look at this as not like a photograph, I hope, but also even a photograph is a man-made artifact through human technology, but depersonalized. But when we look at this painting, we are thinking about Caspar David Friedrich, the painter, right? We're not ever absent that. Whereas a painting that tries to just be nature, this is actually something that we'll get to with Schiller, right? So there's the poet who tries to imitate nature, and then there's the poet who tries to be nature. So that's the naive and sentimental poetry. But even when an artwork attempts to be nature, attempts to be a natural phenomenon, we know that it isn't, right? We know that it's an artificial phenomenon, that it's not a fully spontaneous happening, but it's something that a human being has made happen. And that's why the practical reason of the human action is never entirely gone, but it is interesting to think, why would artists move in a direction where they try to minimize or try to eliminate or hide that? Right? Even an aleatory technique, like a randomization technique, is still a human contrivance. It's not actually random. Mm-hmm.
But theoretically, if you were to see something man-made which wasn't intended to be seen in an aesthetic way, but you see it aesthetically,
then
have the same response as nature, it just happens to be man-made.
Then, right. I mean, basically the point here is, because Kant's not really concerned about art very much. He really isn't. Schiller is going to be more concerned with art making in comparison to Kant and Hegel. So he's only interested in the experience of art, not in the making of it. Right, so it would be, yes, so of course we can encounter human-made artifacts as if they are spontaneous phenomena of nature. We can experience, I don't know, the ruins, architectural ruins of a building, and it can strike us as making sense to our imagination in a way that a forest does. Mm-hmm.
So would you, it's just like I have this example in my head, but it was like, would you feel the same with like the fountain by Duchamp?
Sure, because what does he do with it? He changes its angle, like it's flipped, right? And so you're seeing it in a different way, and so you're seeing it as an aesthetical object, not as a practical object, right? You're not seeing it as something to catch urine, you're seeing it as like a shape, a form in and of itself. And how are we doing that? Well, putting it in an art gallery. So we know culturally we're supposed to be looking at things as if they're art, right? So it's putting us in the mode of emphasizing our aesthetical imagination of the object rather than our practical use of it. But again, why didn't people do that until the 20th century? Well, actually they kind of did in the way they treated objects and representation, right? So, but the question is, why was that? Why would anyone be impelled to do that? But that's something that we'll get to much later in the course. Maddie?
What about singing music? Like, is that a natural phenomenon? Is that still like a processed human phenomenon? Because there are birds that are singing as well, without as much intention. So it's like, would that be still music? Is that still an object in the way that it is? Would you
Question is,
judge it that
do we experience it as having a form? Do we experience it as having a purposiveness? Right, so with the sublime force, with the sublimity of things, what we're dealing with is something that in and of itself may not make sense, but it makes sense to us. How does it make sense to us? So it makes sense to us as a force, in the way that he's talking about it here. So a storm is terrifying, right? It can physically destroy us, but we can take aesthetic pleasure from apprehending it, whether visually or in our imagination. Even to the point, we'll talk about this next week, we name hurricanes. Why do we give hurricanes names? It's as if they're people. It's as if they have a kind of subjectivity. What does that say about the way we imagine them? Right? Because they're not. They're momentary phenomena. Right? They're not really independent. They're not actually autonomous, but they seem to be on the threshold of becoming autonomous, of having a force of their own, a life of their own, so we name them. But we take pleasure in them even though they're very destructive. Right? So what are we taking pleasure in when we take pleasure in viewing or imagining, mentally apprehending a storm? We're taking pleasure in our ability to grasp it as a force. But what kind of a force? Because storm is sort of multiple forces. It's multiple kind of atmospheric forces that are coming together. And yet we attribute the storm itself as having a force. It doesn't, but we apprehend it that way. Why do we apprehend it that way? Because we're doing it. Meaning, our mind has the force that is meeting the phenomenal force, or apparent force, and attributing to it a kind of coherence and even an intentionality that it doesn't actually have in itself. Just like the beautiful object is not beautiful in itself. It's only beautiful in its beautiful aspect. It's only beautiful in our imagination. Similarly, a phenomenon in nature that we experience as sublime, maybe in and of itself, it's not a force. But we experience it as having a force of its own, right? Not just being caused by something else. So strictly speaking, a storm is caused by other things. It's not causing itself. Now, we'll see that when it comes to life forms, there's that question of whether life forms are really autonomous or not. Well, we do experience them that way, but that's because of what we are, because we're autonomous. That's the idea. Because we're free, we attribute freedom to things. Because we're free, we experience the object as beautiful as if it were free. We experience phenomena as having a force as if they were free. But really the force that we experience in them is the force of our own subjectivity in apprehending them. And so freedom as an object, freedom as a force, freedom as a teleological being. That's another way of thinking about how we're analyzing these things. All right, let's take a short break. So let's look at you guys' notes on this, and then we'll work through the reading on the basis of the notes that you guys posted. So, David.
Oh
yeah, you had a question?
Oh yeah, no, it was just about something we said earlier. So, if Kant says true beauty comes from something which is unfamiliar, which you don't expect, right? If the painter's job is to come up with that, that could be one type of painter, that can be their job, Then, in order to produce that, the artist has to do something which they are themselves unfamiliar with and they haven't done before, which is inherently dangerous, or and that's like the point of that's where pleasure is found in painting, because if the painter has that as a goal, then they're always going to be at the edge between having control and losing control.
Okay, so here's an example. Balzac has a novel, The Unknown Masterpiece, right? And so it's the question of whether there is a painting at all, meaning, has the artist produced anything at all? So that should be the risk that the artist is always making when they're making something, that there's a question of whether in the end what they've made is anything at all. Right, so if it only fulfills the concept of the painting, like if you paint in such a way as to always fulfill the concept of painting, then there's a question of whether you are just doing this kind of rote exercise. Right, so it's in the current, modern era that we have this demand that to some degree every work of art should be original, otherwise it's pointless. Right, so if an artwork's not original, it's not worth making.
Do you agree?
I do. Yes, I do. Absolutely.
But how do you define originality at this?
That's where we're going to go. We're going to go there. We're absolutely going to go there, yes. In other words, producing something that exceeds the concept. So, meaning, if painting isn't about changing what painting is, then it's not worth doing.
Does that mean that writing
Yes.
notes for a painting would be...
No, that's not. No. You can. It is conceptual. There is a concept, but it exceeds its concept, right? That's why we were talking earlier about the practical demonstrative character of art. At that, of course you can have a plan, a concept. Of course you're working with a concept. Of course art is based on a concept, but it pushes the envelope on that. Mm-hmm.
So, in an idea, you mentioned earlier that if you were to look at something which wasn't intended to be seen as art, aesthetically it's analogous to seeing nature, because it's, right? But if you make an unoriginal painting, what you're really doing is you're creating something which is similar to everything else, in the sense that this is a chair and that's a chair, so we don't look at the particularities. We don't see it in the way we really look at a painting. So an unoriginal painting, we similarly don't look at it with the intensity that we would look at a truly original painting. So if the job of the painter is to reinvent painting, the purpose of that is to produce something unexpected in a way that heightens our attention or heightens our perception. And then the only way we can see it aesthetically, because if seeing something aesthetically, seeing something for how it is, then we need to see it fully in order to have that response, which we wouldn't get if we weren't looking properly, which would happen if it was unoriginal.
Okay, so in terms of what it is, very basic point, art makes you see something that isn't actually there. The trick of the eye, the trompe l'oeil. So, music, when we listen to it, sounds more than just patterned noise. But it is patterned noise, isn't that what it is? Like, in other words, if you look at the signal in the MP3 file, isn't it just patterned noise? Well, no. In our listening, what makes it beautiful music is what we're doing with it experientially, subjectively, exercising our aesthetic faculty. Right? So the artist's job is to help us hear more than patterned noise. In the same way, the painter's job is to help us see more than just pigment on a surface. Because that's all that it is. It's just pigment on a surface, and yet we see more than pigment on a surface when we look at a painting. So it's not there in the physical object, it's only there in our imagination. Right, so that's
you know, in other words, when we see something as inartistic, we're seeing it as more dead, mechanical, rote. We're seeing it as less alive, you know. So, you know, a better work of art seems more alive to us than an inferior work of art.
So it's not really there, it's only there like in our imagination.
In our experience of it,
Yeah.
right. Subjectively. So the
yeah.
whole point of Kant is to say the subject is real. The subject is real. Right? In other words, it's not like a kind of, because this would be David Hume empiricism, which is that there is no subject. There's just sense data perception of things. The subject has nothing in and of itself. Or if it does, it's just a sort of set of, you know, faculties that are more or less hardwired, right? But it has no metaphysical substance. And Kant is saying, no, the subject is real. The subject is real by virtue of not because we're creaturely organisms, but because we're free. Meaning because we can change our subjectivity, that's what gives subjectivity substance. If we could only respond as animals, then there wouldn't be a subjectivity, there would just be animality, there would just be organism. Right? So, now the way that ancient people, before bourgeois society, before modern society, the way ancient people understood this was that the artists were channeling divine forces. Art was bound up with religious experience, and art presented divine forces aesthetically. So art was seen as divine, and actually the labor of the artist was not seen as divine. The labor of the artist was just seen as kind of incidental, and what was coming through the labor of the artist was actually the work of the gods or the spirits or the divine forces. So what Kant does, and we'll see this with Schiller and Hegel as well, is that he says what the ancients called the gods or the spirits or the divine forces is actually us in our freedom. It's freedom that's divine. We're going to get there today because of the concept of God as sublime. Right, so basically, and we'll do that with Hegel as well. He'll talk about our different ways of thinking about the gods across history. When the gods were like bestial, it's because humans were bestial. Right, and so we'll see the turning point as in a kind of a monotheism, the way Kant sees it, which is that rather than the gods being powerful beings that are tormenting us, that are terrifying us and destroying us, God is sublime. But that's because of a change in the way we experience the world. We don't experience the world as terrifying and destroying us, but we experience it as sublime. And so it's a change in the subject. And so, again, can we recognize the divine character of art as our own doing, as our own freedom? Or do we have to go back to, because artists do this, by the way, in the modern era, artists get into like mysticism, and, right? The surrealists do this other thing, which is like psychoanalysis, right? And usually it's some admixture of Freud and Jung. The Jungian is like the mystical part. That's the sort of irrational part. But you know, if you think about like Theosophy is the famous example of like abstract art in the early 20th century, and this kind of new kind of pseudo-religion, like spiritual mysticism, as like motivating, like that they thought that's what the art was, that it was like a mystical phenomenon. Again, Kant is saying, well, yes, it is a mystical phenomenon, but that's because freedom is mystical. Freedom is a mystical phenomenon, right? It's not because there is some kind of mystical realm out there. It's us, it's in us, it's in our faculties, it's in our subjectivity, it's in our freedom. That's really the point. I don't know if that quite answered it. Because again, the human character of the artistic creation is going to be a tricky thing. We're going to trace that between Kant, Schiller, and Hegel. We'll see. We'll see where it goes. Because Hegel's going to flip it and say, actually, when we're talking about the beautiful, we're not talking about nature, we're talking about art. Only art can be beautiful in this way. Nature actually can't be.
Precisely because it's man-made.
Because it's, right, because it's human created. That's right. Okay, so how shall we work through these? Julie is the most extensive notes that we have, and then we've also got Nicholas.
I didn't know we had to volunteer. I didn't know we had to volunteer. I thought it was a mandatory thing.
Yeah, you don't. So who are my presenters? Who are my volunteers? Okay, so maybe Juliana? You want to at least guide us through or summarize the main points of your notes?
Yeah, I first just kind of went through some of the words that I saw that like came up a lot, especially in the conversation that he brought, because I mean, there was a lot of babble, in my opinion, like if you like rephrase his words, so I just made notes to go back and like be like, okay, that word meant that. In conversation to that. So that was my first kind of notes. I then went into the first, which was the Sublime, and explaining the Sublime, which I believe was page 30. It was like 23 to like.
You mean the sections?
Yes, the section. I started with the Sublime, yeah. For explaining what the Sublime is to my own understanding and his words. And the Sublime to rise above to, you know, I didn't think what I was going to say. It was 23 I started.
Oh, 23. Okay, so where we were.
Yes, very good. I did the quote about though we must seek a ground external to ourselves for the beautiful of nature, but seek it for the sublime merely in ourselves and our attitude of thought, which introduces sublimity into no representation of nature. I thought that was a fantastic quote, at least for me, summarized a lot of what sublimity is. I'm like, you know, coming upon a mountain and you're just in awe of this mountain, but of course it's terrifying because it could collapse on you at any second. The nature is chaos, the nature is wild, and that's what makes it so sublime, is that we have no control over it, yet we still exist into it. And then I did genius because I thought that would also summarize, because mostly what he said then about poetry and then the ranking of what he assumes, you know, is the ranking of
the art forms?
Yeah, which he hates science, man. He really has some beef with some scientists.
He does.
Yeah. So I did genius as a talent for art, not science, because we already know science, you can learn science. And then artistic talent, who supposes definite concept of product as purpose, therefore understanding and imagination. Of course, where you talk about these concepts, shows itself not in the proposed purpose of a definite concept, and then the unsought unassigned subjective purpose follows no rules, can only the nature of subject produce. The question I proposed was, I wonder what Kant would think of today's art world, especially seeing that like the line between scientists and artists has been completely collapsed and has been moved across back and forth. And I referenced some artists that I see doing that in today's world. So I just was that I don't quite know how he would respond, or if he'd be like, still not, like, because it rises above just science, because there's a collective more thought that he would think it still technically resides off of art, but like, I wonder what he'd think of the artists and scientists collaborating in such a way that we do today.
So let's use a kind of expression, a common expression. We will say that politics is an art, not a science. Right? We'll use that kind of an expression. What do we mean by that? What we mean by that is that politics takes judgment It's not going to function following a script. Right? So, what is it that Donald Trump says that he has above other politicians? They lack judgment. They don't know how to negotiate. They don't know how to exercise judgment. They make bad judgment calls. They make bad decisions because they can't exercise judgment. So the war on terror, the invasion of Afghanistan, the occupation of Iraq, these all showed lack of judgment. They kind of followed a script, kind of blindly. Right, so they had all sorts of experts, all sorts of scientists involved, all sorts of foreign policy experts, all sorts of experts in war, policy experts, bureaucrats. That's what a bureau is a bureau of experts, and a bureaucracy is the rule of like experts. But they don't know how to make judgments, and that's why they make bad decisions. That's what this means, right? It means art goes beyond science because art calls for judgment in a way that science does not. Now, of course, is that actually true? No, not entirely. But that common expression that we have, that something is an art, not a science, what we mean by that is that we have to feel our way through things, intuitively make judgment calls. We can't just follow a script. That's what that means, right? Now, of course, scientists, especially when scientists are making, if we think about science in a more heroic way, right, then we're thinking of new discoveries. Then, of course, it involves creativity, originality, genius, judgment. Of course it does, absolutely. He's just using that kind of commonsensical distinction that we make. We might say that what he's calling science here would be like, I don't know, like applied science or engineering, but even then, because that's the realm of practical reason, right? So he's setting up this kind of polarity between those two things in a way that may not fully hold up, but that's because he's talking about what art is. He's not talking about what science is. Now we'll see, he will next time come back around to like his critique of Newton, of Isaac Newton, and that's because he has a critique of a mechanical view of the world. Right, so he basically thinks a mechanical view of the universe, which he associates with science, is an inadequate view of the universe because it can't explain life, and of course it can't explain freedom. Right? In other words, it can describe things in terms of what exists, but only in a very mechanical and deterministic way. But it can't describe the spontaneity of life in nature, nor can it describe freedom. Right. So that's really the point of that. Let's go back to this issue of the beautiful and the sublime. So again, what he's doing, moving from the beautiful to the sublime and next week to teleology, is that he's sort of building his argument. So he's saying, okay, with the experience of the beautiful, it appears to be about the object. It is about the subject, but it appears to be about the object. It appears to be an experience prompted externally. And therefore, we really believe it's about the object, that we're kind of convinced by the phenomenal appearance of the object as the source of our feeling. I think the Hamza Walker, didn't he say about the alienation, the object is not the source, but can only prompt it? Yep, so this is a little Kantian idea. So, whereas with the sublime, what the sublime, as distinguished from the beautiful, highlights is that it's really more about the subject than it is about the object. In other words, that becomes clearer. So there's a kind of clarification that's provided by the sublime that may not be there in the experience of the beautiful. And the clarification is that, okay, now it seems to be much more clearly or unmistakably about the subject. It is for him always about the subject, but the way it appears to us. Now again, that's curious because it would seem to be about the object, except if it were just about the object in the case of the sublime, then it would be this kind of overwhelming phenomenon. It would be sort of external to us. It's only when we overcome that, what we're recognizing, when we recognize something as sublime, the experience of sublimity is actually the sublimity of our own subjectivity. It's not the sublimity of the phenomenon. When we experience something as beautiful, it still appears to be about the beautiful object. It's not the beautiful imagination, it's the beautiful object. With the sublime, it's the sublimity of our own apprehension of things, not the sublimity of the phenomenon. It's the force of our own subjectivity, not the force of the phenomenon, that is sublime. He thinks. That's the move he's making. And that's why it's edifying, right? So I think Schiller also has this description of like melting beauty and bracing beauty. So there's like beauty that sort of makes you feel like you're kind of melting, and then there's beauty that makes you feel like you're bracing, and that kind of edifying feeling, he sees that as being more attribute of the sublime. It sort of makes you feel more powerful as a subject, in a way that, again, the beautiful isn't really about that, he thinks. So in terms of the feeling of pleasure, again, with the beautiful, the pleasure seems to be coming from the object, whereas in the sublime, the pleasure seems to come from ourselves. The strength of our own subjectivity. That's what we're taking pleasure in. Because the phenomenon is actually something that causes us pain. Right, so that's how the distinction can be made apparent with the sublime, he thinks. Right. So in terms of the blurring of the line between the artist and the scientist, it's a curious thing, isn't it? I don't know. It's almost as if, so I will give you my little uncharitable view of things. So my uncharitable view of things is that artists have a very hard time justifying themselves as artists, and art has a hard time justifying itself as art, and so it seeks to have authorization or justification outside itself. So it's kind of like, if you can justify your art as research, then it's legit, in a way that if it's just art, it's kind of not legit. That's terrible. That's awful. No. Children, revolt against this, please. You must fight back. Art has its own dignity. Don't rest on the authority of other things. No. Fight that. Fight against the dying of the light. You must. No, because the disappearance of art is just very tragic. Imagine if the scientists rule the world and artists have to pretend to be scientists. Dr. Fauci is not an artist. Not an artist. Do you know why he's not an artist? He had no communication skills. He had no way of dealing with people's feelings. Right? He was a very bad public messenger. Right? That's why people didn't trust him. Right? He failed as an artist. Doesn't have the art of oratory. The art of oratory, children, it's there in the reading. The art of oratory. Fauci should have stayed in his cubicle, right? He shouldn't be out in the public expressing his opinion. He should just be supervising the number crunchers. That's where he belongs. Not an artist. He's a bureaucrat. But artists have to be bureaucrats now, don't they? Because they have to appeal for grant money from other bureaucrats. And so they have to like be copacetic with the bureaucrats. No, fight that. You must rebel. Freedom, revolution, let's do this.
So those are all the things you have to apply for, like grad school, grants, scholarship, fellowship.
Yeah.
All the
no.
writing makes
Can I
us
just
want
say
to-
academia is the death of intellect? Academia is the death of intellect. No academic publisher would ever publish Kant's Critique of Judgment if it was written today. No. No. It would be unacceptable as academic work. And that doesn't mean that Kant is unacceptable as academic work. It means that academia is unacceptable as human freedom, because it's the opposite of human freedom. It is. All right, so that's what I have to say about the blurring of the line between art and science, is that we live in this like science society, like STEM fields or something. STEM. Like I feel like STEM fields means that like metal rods are being put into my brain. STEM. No. No. Wait, did we quite? Okay, question. Oh, continue.
And then I said that many things like kind of want to rant for a bit about like how beautiful art can only have imagination, understanding, spirit, and space, and kind of goes into that. So I wrote that down. There's many things on there about beautiful art and that. And then of course the only three kinds of beautiful art is the art of speech, performative arts, and the play of sensation, which goes into depth. But I just put that was long, so I just put what they were.
Okay, so the formative arts would be, we also call them the plastic arts. So that would be painting and sculpture. The art of speech, okay, so these are going to be a little bit foreign to us. So play of sensations, let's maybe start there. So so there's the plastic arts and then what we would now call the performative arts, right? So the language that we have is plastic arts, performative arts. And performative arts would be basically arts that thematize time, duration, etc. Now, of course, the plastic arts do that too, but less sort of prominently. We could say that in the performative or the performing arts, you have time, duration, temporality is sort of prominently thematized. Because of course, looking at a painting or looking at a sculpture is a durational activity. It is an activity. It's not just like a static thing. But this is what he's getting into with the play of sensations, meaning, there's drama, poetry, music. Now, poetry, I just want to say, he considers it to be the highest art. Poetry for him, in his time, it is written on the page, it is reading, it is written, but that's a representation of something that's understood as performative. Right, so it would fit more into the category of music, drama, stage drama. Now the art of speech, let's go back to that one. What is that about? I already mentioned oration, so what is that about? Because you could say he's already setting up a hierarchy here. Right, like the art of speech is the sort of basic, and then the formative arts, and then the play of sensations.
Could it be more so for entertainment and for pleasure? The
Right, so rhetoric, right, so there's sort of logic and then there's rhetoric. So the art of speech is the art of not only like speaking logically, but also speaking with rhetorical force. Right, so again, a kind of a logical elocution or a logical speech, a logical argumentation, because of course that would be the first form of logic. So we might think of logic as something that you read on a page. No, the first form of logic would be a speech act, it would be a kind of logical exposition in speech. And yet, we don't only convince according to logical reason, we also convince by rhetoric. In other words, we address the listener not only in concepts or theories or understanding, but also at the level of feeling.
So you talk about the tone of the voice.
Right, so the art of speech meaning the emphasis with which things are given. But also the verbal form. Uh-huh.
It's like how you say it rather than what you say.
Absolutely, how you say it.
Like, pragmatics, linguistic,
What's the term in linguistics? Pragmatics.
yeah.
Explain that. I think I know what you mean.
Yeah, like just sometimes use.
Right, so you're playing with connotation, usage, right. So you're not only, you're not just using the strict meaning of words, but you're also invoking all the cultural connotation, right. So again, rhetoric. Now, let's unpack that. So in the art of speech, you can say more than simply the words.
Yeah, suggestion.
Right. In other words, it suggests beyond like the mere words. Similarly, the formative arts, the plastic arts. We were talking about this earlier. So painting and sculpture, insofar as they're artistic, they cause us to see more than is physically there. Right? In other words, they have a aesthetic, formal suggestiveness in the same way that the art of speech communicates more than the mere words. The formative arts appear to us to be more than the physical object that is made. Now, the play of sensations. So the play of sensations, again, this is where you are kind of creating a coherence across the play of sensations that in and of themselves the play of sensations would not have. Right, so this is why he considers poetry to be a higher art form than music. Because when you are hearing poetry, but also when you're reading poetry, all sorts of things are happening at the same time. So you're hearing, because his notion of poetry would be rhyme and meter, it would be verse. So you're hearing the words and their meaning, you are getting the cultural connotation and the usage, you are getting the rhetoric, but you're also getting the musicality of the words, and you're getting the images, right? So lyric poetry would be the main example of poetry here. You're also getting images. So it's kind of firing on all cylinders in terms of activating your imagination. You're getting images, you're getting rhyme and meter, musicality, and you're getting the speech, the rhetoric of the art of speech. It's all happening. Right? In a way that music, for example, would be a more kind of abstract version of that, where he says, and this is where we go back to the distinction between the charming and the beautiful. Right, so he kind of thinks the music is more like charming, in the sense that it doesn't give full play to the imagination the way poetry does.
His example is also music and color, right?
Uh-huh.
Both could be reduced to just sensation, pleasurable sensation, but the point would be beautiful form rather than mere sensation.
Oh, right. So exactly. So when we think of what he's saying about the formative arts and the art of color, right? So abstract art. Now we would think of abstract art as basically being like just color and not like images, right? So it would be, because he talks about that, about like like how painting has to be more than mere decoration. Right, so it can't just be a visual pattern or color. So the elements of painting, line and color, in the art of painting is about more than that. It's not only about getting you to see line and color that isn't on the surface, but it's also, activating your imagination. It's kind of giving you images. So he doesn't really have a notion of abstract art. That wouldn't really make sense to him. Abstract art would not make sense to him. There's figurative art, and in fact, it's in its figuration that painting is art.
So if a painting's outside, if a painting is mere decoration, then you're viewing it as just colour, but because it draws on our imagination of the world, that's where it comes out to decoration.
That's right.
With abstract art, would you say that symbolism continues through abstract art in a way that connects it to the world without necessarily representing the world?
It could.
His point with color and music would be that it could be about sensation, but music orders sensation,
right.
Structure sensation,
right.
Painting structure color.
That's right.
And it had because he talks about how individual people might like a certain color or tone in terms of sensation, but that's not the universal communicability of beauty, which is more than just your pleasure and sensation.
That's right. So can music present more than just sounds that we find pleasant? Because after all, some people are going to like saxophones and some people are not. Right? Some people are going to respond very well to woodwinds, other people more to strings. Right? So the art of music can't merely be that any more than the art of painting can merely be about the sensation of color. Mm-hmm.
So here's another idea. Often when you go to listen to, say, a music performance, description, you're going with an audience, or in an audience.
Uh-huh.
And because you might experience the music and you make some kind of judgment, like you enjoy it, you have a good time, because everyone else is having a good time, the meaning doesn't necessarily come in how the music relates outside of itself, but in your shared experience of that with other people. And the same thing can happen with art. So say a painting might not signify anything outside of itself, but if you experience and see value in it, just as other people you're with or other people see it the same way, such as the artist, it has meaning through your connection with other people, shared experience of that thing.
That would be, okay, so that's different. That's conviviality. That is the pleasure that we take in being with others and engaging in cultural rituals. And again, that would be explicable, meaning that would be pretty straightforward, that we like being with other people and we like sharing feelings with others, having the same experience. There's a pleasure in that kind of universality. Now, again, he's not denying that exists. What he's saying, however, is that can be explained in other ways. In other words, that is not something that can only be explained as a matter of the faculty of judgment with respect to an aesthetical form.
It could be just the resultant concept. Right.
Well, or it could be, it could be all sorts of things. It could be, practical. It could be, I guess you could say it's according to a concept. It could also be the conviviality that animal nature gives us. It could be psychology. It could be mood. Right. So what he's talking about is, what about the feelings that we have that are not explicable in any other way? rather than through the power of the aesthetical imagination and the judgments that follow from that. Right, of course Kant thinks, yeah, it feels good to be around people and to hang out and to have a shared experience, and whether it's watching a sports game or riding a roller coaster or being in a mosh pit at a quote unquote concert. No, not a concert. It's just some kind of like, I don't know what, anarcho-primitivist.
He did highlight the importance of like social society and the sociability.
Yes.
Of like in the beautiful part, not in the
Mm-hmm.
the aesthetic judgment.
So that's why, right. So let's think about that. The universality of the beautiful does have a more sociable aspect.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's unpack how and why that might be the case. Well, because that's something that we can sort of externalize and agree upon. And we can communicate, right? So we can, you can point at something, the beautiful object, and even if someone doesn't judge it as beautiful, when you say to someone that you find that beautiful, they know what you're talking about, even if they don't feel the same way about it. Mm-hmm.
There is a good quote that is on the second one of beauty.
Mm-hmm.
Because this pleasure is not caused by personal interest, but judgment of beauty can come in the regular validity. So it's that even if I'm like concept or determining once somebody suggests this is beautiful, you'll agree upon that personal interest.
All right, so let's unpack that a bit. So it's sociable in the sense of I find something beautiful because I could, because it's possible for me to do so. And because it's possible for me to do so, others, it's also possible for them. So what I have in common with them is not my psychology, my mood, my physical circumstances, my life history. All those things I might not have in common with other people. So what do I have in common with other people? That we could have that experience, that judgment, that's possible, right? Not that we do, but that we could, right? So we all have different experiences, we all have different circumstances, we all have different moods, different psychologies. However, what we have in common is this faculty, the possibility of this faculty, and that's what makes it sociable. Again, so looked at, not just in terms of like the individual and the collective, but looked at cross-culturally, historically. So human communities, insofar as they do things that are not just according to their animal nature, what we find is that all cultures have had notions of the beautiful. All cultures have had art. All cultures have therefore objectified, externalized the beautiful. And yet, the art across different cultures and across historical time varies a great deal. Yet what they all have in common is art. Meaning what art is particularly varies a great deal. The universality is in art itself. So even though different people respond to things aesthetically differently, different people experience different things as beautiful, what they have in common is that they experience things as beautiful. That they can experience things as beautiful. That's what they have in common. That's what's universal. Not the particular object that's judged as beautiful, but the ability to judge it so. That's really the point. And that's really important, because again, it's just sort of stepping back and saying, because otherwise it's kind of like, oh, what's beautiful? How can we ever agree on that? Blah, blah, blah. No. That's not the point. The point is, we know what we're talking about when we say it, and even if our particular judgments are different, the universality among those particular judgments is that we have that capability of that judgment at all. Right. It's a potential impossibility. So this is also true of the sublime. So it would appear to be the case that, maybe what we can not be overwhelmed by changes, because he does think historically it seems that we've developed over the long course of history a more sublime view of nature than we started out with. He just has to look in Western history. He just has to look at the gods of classical antiquity, like the Greek and Roman gods are these horrible beings that just make us into their playthings and destroy us willfully, and the movement from that to a more Mosaic or Christian or Islamic concept of God is a very changed relationship to the divine, where we're no longer the sort of bastard offspring and sadistic playthings of the gods, which is what we were. But now, right, God is like a companion, a kind of forgiving, compassionate companion, not a horrible, sadistic tormentor out to destroy us. And what does he say about that? Something about society had to have changed. Something about society had to have been changed. Meaning, maybe the earliest communities are terrifying, sadistic things to the people who inhabit them. But our society has developed such that civilization, right, has developed such that we now experience society not as terrifying, but as sublime, as fearful, but not overwhelmingly annihilating. Because that's what terror would mean. It would mean the annihilation of the subject. Now, of course, maybe, hello children, 2024, maybe in capitalism, society has reverted to being a terrifying, not a sublime phenomenon. But it is interesting that Kant thought, in his moment, that society was no longer terrifying. But maybe it is again for us now. And that's sad. And that might affect our aesthetic judgment of things. I think it has too. Right. It has. So what that means is that we have an impaired experience of freedom in comparison to Kant's time. Right, so what I described earlier about like the Jacobin terror and revolution and Thomas Jefferson saying, yeah, if everybody dies except Adam and an Eve survive and they're free, then it's worth it. Well, that's a very optimistic view, isn't it? It's an extremely optimistic view, meaning that we will, as a species, continue to develop our freedom, and maybe it will take a monstrous sacrifice that will be unjust, but in the end, it will work out for the best. And can we say that today? Not really. Not really. That would just sound crazy. What was it that Mao said about the Cold War? He said a third world war might be good because communism will prevail because there are more Chinese. That doesn't quite work the same way, does it? That doesn't quite work the same way. Somehow. This doesn't quite work the same way. Without getting into the details. I have my opinion, of course, as to why that might be the case. All right, so we did not get through all the notes. David, did you have anything you wanted to add? Oh, the mathematical and the dynamic. We didn't talk about the dynamic. So the mathematical we described already. The dynamic is, of course, this more kind of interactive relative character. That's what dynamic means in that context. And so that's why the dynamic sublime is really the proper concept of the sublime, according to Kant. You want to say something about, because I noticed from your notes from last week, Maddie, the sensible and the supersensible, and the gap and the sharks. Not whales, but sharks. Although maybe a killer whale, which is somewhat like a shark. So, because again, we want to run and hide when we hear these terrifying expressions like a priori and also supersensible. All that supersensible means in that context is not reducible to our sensation, not reducible to our sense perception. You know, again, that we're able to imagine more than the senses inform us about. Right? And so actually that gap with the sharks, no, it's not, there isn't this like abyss or gulf like that you don't want to fall into because then you'll be eaten by the sharks. No, it's more two different moments, right? So there's the moment of the sensible, there's the moment of the supersensible. The supersensible is simply what transcends what we can construct with our imagination on the basis of our sense perception, but that is not reducible back to our sense perception.
What transcends from our actual experience or imagination?
Right. The idea would be, and again, we're doing it all the time, so it's not like some rare moment. We're doing it all the time, that we're taking in sense data perception, but we're actively constructing the world with our imagination, even as we're taking in sense data perception. That's simply what we do as subjects. To be a subject means that you're seeing more in the world than is there. You're seeing more in the world than mere stimulation of your senses.
Is that a little bit of manifestation?
It's appearance. Yes, it is. Phenomenal appearance. So if you recall from Robert Pippin on the first day of class, he said, Kant on appearance. Right? He sort of ticked off what you need from the various philosophers in critical philosophy and critical theory. You need Kant on appearance. So why is that? Well, because again, appearance, phenomenal manifestation, semblance, a term that we'll get to, Erscheinung. Right, so the way things appear to us is important because, in fact, things appear to us as more than an aggregate of sense data. So again, our mind, we could say, constructs out of our sense data perception, and that construction, the mental image we have of the world, that's our achievement of our imagination. And so here's to bring it back around to what I was saying earlier about all cultures across all of history have had art. They've also had religion and other things. They've had language. So they've all had the imagination. So how do we know that? Because human beings have the same senses. We've had the same senses for a long time, tens of thousands of years. But what has developed historically, what you can observe in culture, what you can observe in religion, we were talking about the progress in religion, what you can observe in the history of art is that what has changed is not our sense data perception of things. What has changed, what has developed, has been our imagination. So that's the variable part, that's the free part. So ironically, that's the most universal part. So you would think, okay, what's universal is that we're all Homo sapiens and have the same physical senses. Actually, the most universal part is the faculty of aesthetic judgment and imagination that changes and develops historically. and societally. All right, so we didn't get to genius. Let's come back to genius. Kind of jumped over that. Let's come back to that at the beginning of class next time. Okay, have a good weekend and good week next week, and I'll see you.